Alright, so on the transmission on this shaft here, we have this O-ring and this collar with these marks in it. These marks go to the inside. And could have put this on when I put the engine together, but just so it doesn't fall out, I waited. So just feed that O-ring inside there. Like that. And then slide the collar on. Also, I forgot to mention I did do this, but grease that lip before you put the collar back in. Alright, so the next thing I did was went ahead and cleaned my piston and took out the ring so I can do some inspections on them. This piston was pretty nasty, had a lot of carbon buildup. You can still see a little bit on there, but I got most of it off, cleaned it up pretty nicely. This thing was pretty much completely black, but check the piston, everything's good with that. It does still have some more life in it, so I'm not going to replace it right now. Went ahead and pulled out the piston rings and cleaned them up as well. When you do pull them out, just be careful. Good way to do it. Just lift one side up out of the groove and then twist it around like that to get it out, and it won't bend or put any stress on these rings. So now we can go ahead and do some inspections on them, check some clearances and everything else. If you want to know how to do all that, you can look it up in your service manual. It tells you step by step exactly how to do it. Alright, so when installing the piston rings, the service manual does have a specific way, not necessarily in order, but a specific way and alignment of these piston rings. So they have what's called a circle mark here. It's only on one side. So facing that, whichever way is easiest. I like to start with the oil ring expander first. So with the oil ring expander, the gap here actually goes opposite, so 180 degrees from your circle mark. So it should be facing the back. So you just put it in, turn around so the camera can see it better. Easiest way I've found to do this is just kind of put it in like that and then feed it around. You don't want to put too much tension on this thing, outward tension. This one's a little hard to see just because it lines up so perfectly, but you can spread it a little bit as you turn it and make sure it's 180 degrees opposite of your circle marker. So then your two steel oil rings, one goes below that expander and one goes on top. And here's your circle marker. So from opposite of it, put them at about maybe 30 degrees opposite of each other. So you've got 180 degrees from the circle marker and then just out to, somewhere in here. Doesn't have to be exact, but so they face out at opposite angles. So I'll start with the bottom one first. You want to do this carefully so your oil ring expander doesn't turn too much in there. Okay, so that one's in place and it's lined up right about here. So then we'll go on top, opposite of that. Same thing, just feed it around. This is a pretty good way to do it because it doesn't put a lot of tension on the ring. You don't want to bend the ring or whatever, so this kind of just puts it in, just barely expands it around the outside. One important note here on this top ring, I know this is a bad camera angle, but it's really hard to see, so I had to bring it up here to show you. Right there, you'll see a little etched R, and it's really hard to see, even with the naked eye. So when you install the top ring into the piston, make sure the R, at least on the KX450, faces up before you install it. Here's your dot marker. So the top ring actually just lines up straight with this one. Just feed that into the top ring. Spot there, the notch for it. And same thing, just kind of feed it around, apply a little bit of pressure inwards, and then you can just snap it into place. And this one has a little bit of movement, so you can guide it kind of where it needs to be. And you know, it may move around a little bit as you're, especially when you're putting this piston back on the push rod, the connecting rod. You know, it may move. These bottom ones don't really move much. There's pretty good amount of tension holding all three together in there, the two oil rings and the oil ring expander. But this one moves around quite a bit, so before you put this back in the cylinder, you just want to make sure it's straight, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. All right, now we're going to go ahead and install the piston on the connecting rod. One thing to note, this goes straight down into the case. So I went ahead and put a rag, can't really see it, but I put a rag down first, and then I also put paper towels on top of the rag. That way if something drops off here, which is actually pretty easy to do, it's not gonna fall down in the case. That's the last thing you want after you've done all this work getting everything back together. So I know it seems simple, should go without saying, but make sure you cover the entryway into the case for anything that may fall off, because, you know, especially these little snap rings that you're gonna be putting in there, easy to drop, they'll go flying sometimes. So just make sure you got that in there. All right guys, real quick, I do gotta say this is embarrassing, but I do it all the time. I know it when I do it and I forget to correct in this video, or to say it. I will correct it, you know, with text or whatever throughout the video, so you've already probably seen it, been like, this guy's an idiot. But for some reason I always mix up snap rings and circlips. Just the name, not the placement of them, but the name. I've always done this. I don't know why I do it. I don't know what it is, so I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But snap ring, obviously, circlip. So all right, so we're ready to install the piston. Before we get there, let's take a little dab of engine oil, install it on the inside here of the connecting rod. Now take our piston. So the circle marker goes towards the front, the exhaust side. So the intake sides are bigger, the exhaust side is smaller. The circle marker is the exhaust side, and it goes towards the front. So we'll put that on top. Take our rod here, install it through the piston. Through the connecting rod. Now we can just lay that over and go ahead and install our snap rings. Get it right this time. So people can do this with their hands. So I'm gonna fumble with this while I film. I'll probably just edit it out, but there you go. That's exactly why you install the paper towels before you put these on. These things go flying all the time. There we go. All right, so snap rings in place, just feel around, make sure it's in there. I'm gonna go to the other side. Now your piston's installed. Go ahead and check the alignment of the rings if you've already put them in, like I did earlier. So this one's good, the other side's good. And then again, this top ring does move quite a bit, but actually is still good. And then move it around if you need to. Okay, now that we got the piston installed, go ahead and insert our timing chain onto the gears here. Make sure it's got good engagement on the teeth. Next, bottom chain guide and bolt. This top part just goes over this collar here. The torque specs are really low. It's only 62 inch-pounds. That translates to only 5.1 foot-pounds. Next, rear chain guide and the hex bolt. So that goes in with the bow in towards the motor. Torque spec on this one is 11 foot-pounds. Also not much. Okay, now that's done, it's time to install the cylinder. Okay, so when installing the cylinder, before you do it, put some oil around the rings, engine oil, and around the piston here, and then as well as on the inside wall of the cylinder, all the way around, get a nice, just thin coating on there. And then before we put it on, we're gonna check the orientation of our rings. So when we install this, you wanna put pressure on the rings with this hand, and then with this hand, push them back flush with the front of the piston. Then take your cylinder, put it on this side slightly down first, and that'll hold the tension on those piston rings. Then you can move back here, press them forward, and then start easing it down on there. And as you go, you can see it's kind of hard to see the oil ring there. When this cylinder wall gets to it, you want to make sure and put pressure right there, because if it's sticking out a little bit like it probably is, when this gets on, it'll start pushing down and won't clear it. Just ease it down on there. Oops. And then at some point before it gets too low, you can either drop the chain back down in, or you can feed it up through as you're doing this. Just don't forget to do that eventually. Same with the chain guide. Actually, for the video, I'm gonna drop it down just so it's not in the way of the camera. And don't forget to check the other side oil ring. Okay, so once you clear the oil rings, kind of home free, and you can just help it down, give it a little light tap. There, so the dowel pins, just make sure that those line up with their respective holes. There you go. The closer the motor is to top dead center, the easier it is, because you can use the entire length of the stroke to help it go down in. One thing to note, don't forget to put this bolt in before you put the rest of the top end on, because otherwise you can't feed it in there. All right, so the torque spec on that is 106 inch-pounds, which is only 8.8 foot-pounds. Okay, next we'll move on to the flywheel installation. All right, so for the flywheel, first, motor's at top dead center, so the notch on top. We're going to install our little half moon piece here, face down. It's called a Woodruff key. Okay. Then the flywheel with the notch lined up. Make sure you clean this off good. Otherwise it may not seat properly in there. Just a little contact cleaner and a paper towel wipe down will do. Next, thread on the nut. Torque spec on this is 59 foot-pounds. All right, so next, loosen it back up, the nut, after you've tightened it down to 59 foot-pounds. Set that aside for now. Then you're actually gonna take your Tusk flywheel puller, or whatever flywheel puller you have. Thread the flywheel puller on. Make sure you have this out far enough so you get maximum engagement. There we go. You actually don't need the holder tool for this, you can just do it by hand. You can hold this thing. So now you're gonna set your torque wrench to 15 PSI, or 15 foot-pounds. And all you're gonna do is rotate this, and you can see I didn't get to 15 and it came off. So that means I didn't have it on there all the way, not a big deal. Probably what happened was I didn't have it clean enough, so just hit this little contact cleaner, clean it off and dry it off. And then the only bad thing is you're gonna have to re-torque it to 59 foot-pounds and repeat the process over, but it's actually good that I didn't have it on there because you can see what it does if it's not on there properly. Okay, so I went ahead and took the nut off, re-torqued it back to 59. And I think it's good this time because it did feel a little harder when I was torquing it down to 59. There was a little more resistance, so now we'll try this again. There you go. Clicks at 15. The torque wrench clicks. We're there. And the flywheel stayed on, so that means I installed it properly. And now you can go ahead, put your nut back on and re-torque it back to 59 for the final time. And your flywheel's installed. All right, so now before we put on the cylinder head, we want to install the front chain guide and pull the chain up through. And the reason it's important to do this before we put the cylinder head on is you can see this notch right here. These have to go inside that, and then on the cylinder head bottom, it's flat. So if you put the cylinder head on first, you can't get this in there. Additionally, there's this little notch here that goes right down and hooks into that. But the main thing is, if you put the cylinder head on and you haven't put this in first, you're gonna have to pull the cylinder head off to put this back in, so don't forget that. All right, so down on the bottom here is actually a guide to where the bottom slides in. It's behind the flywheel, but you can see it through the flywheel hole, so just make sure the bottom of that goes into that. It's a little cut V right there, and it'll just set in, and then, you know, it's pretty solid in there, so you know you got it in the right way. All right, so I just kind of dropped the chain down out of the way. Next is the gasket, and it can only go one way. It's got this notch, and that's where this front chain guide sets in. So there's only one way it can go on, and it just sets up underneath there. So coming in from the top, this cylinder head has 2 dowel pins in it, which you're gonna line up and kind of hold that gasket in place as you put it in. So I come down from the top. It's a bit tricky to maneuver it around because there's not much clearance. So just get it in, make sure you get those chain guide arms up through there. There you go. Realign the gasket as necessary. Bring it down and use that dowel pin to help you guide it into position. There we go. And it just sits down into place, and then we can go ahead and install our cylinder head bolts. All right, so for the cylinder head bolts, we're going to start with the big 4 here on top. It's a bolt and a washer. And these actually go down through and hold the cylinder in place as well. That's why they're so long. So remember the 2 shorter ones on the outside and then 2 longer ones marked with this the 2 shorter ones on the inside, 2 longer ones marked on the outside. All right, so we got them snug down finger tight, and now just snug them up in a crisscross pattern. Tighten them down to 44 foot-pounds after we snug them all down. All right, so these 2 cylinder head bolts only torque down to 106 inch-pounds, which is, there you go, only 8.8 foot-pounds, not much. Before we move on, you want to make sure you reach down in and grab your cam chain if you haven't done that already. Just bring it up, and you can put it out of the way and just wire it out of the way until you get the rest of your parts ready. Wire it up to the frame so it doesn't fall down in there again. All right, a few prep things to do before we go on with the final part of the reassembly. So first, you're gonna probably have a little bit of liquid gasket left over along here. So take some contact cleaner or whatever and clean off whatever's left over. And then eventually, before we reinstall the cylinder head cover, we're gonna put some liquid gasket, new liquid gasket from here to here, some leftover Yama Bond or Honda Bond or whatever you're using. I'm gonna wait till towards the end to do that after I get everything in here, just because then I can let it set up overnight. So by the time I get to that, it'll be perfect. I'll be about done for the day, and then I can let it set up overnight. All right, so when I went ahead and snapped the cover back on the magneto, and I finger tighted all the bolts around here, these only torque down to 89 inch-pounds, which is only 7.5 foot-pounds. So crisscross pattern these, and be very careful when you tighten them down not to over torque them. Okay, so I'm gonna do my absolute best to film this. It's gonna be really hard, but you've got your 2 timing marks, and then you've got, well, you can actually kind of see it in there. There's that little timing mark right there. So you can take a 17mm T-handle, put it on there, and then line up the 2 timing marks with that small timing mark there, and that'll give you top dead center. And you want to get it pretty much right there before you go ahead and install your cams up here, because once you install those, you want them to match top dead center. All right, next we're going to install our exhaust cam on this side, and our intake cam on this other side. Now note, your intake cam has a dot right here. So in order to make sure that this is top dead center, you want that dot lined up with this, which I'll show more here shortly. And then the exhaust cam doesn't have a dot, but it has this line right here, which will also run parallel to this. And when they're opposite, your cam lobes will be faced about opposite. So that's a good place to start when you put these in. Make sure that the the intake is pointed back, the lobes, and the exhaust is pointed forward as you're putting these on. Then you can fine tune it from there. It's easier to start with the exhaust side first because the cam tensioner is on this side. So you can pull this side flush with the flywheel, and then the loose side will end up over here, and you can fix that with the cam tensioner. So start with the exhaust side first, and this one's pretty easy. Just pull a little tension on this side here. Not enough to rotate the motor because you don't want to knock it out of top dead center. And then remember, you want the lobes facing opposite, so the exhaust lobes go forward. You just got to be patient with this part of the job here. So you want to get that as close to a line as you can when you set it in. Okay, so right there, it's just about aligned. And just lay this over, and you can look down, align that, make sure there's tension on the chain, which there is. Okay, that lays over, and then when you've got this lined up here, this mark, then you can go down below and make sure that's still at top dead center. So that side's good to go. Okay, so now on our intake cam, remember this dot you want facing the opposite way and lined up here, which will also line up your cam lobes the opposite way as well. Okay, so you can see how loose that chain is. It makes it much easier with the cam tensioner taken out. Again, just take your time with this. Don't get in a hurry or force it in there. Keeping in mind the alignment, you can see right there, it's almost lined up. Oops. This is the harder part of this one because you gotta work with the chain. Take what it'll give you. As you're in the middle of this process, make sure to do periodic checks back with this alignment and your top dead center alignment. Actual top dead center alignment. Okay, so that's right where we want it there. Okay, so we got the chain on, got them both pretty much lined up. Now one last check down here at top dead center. It is a little off, so I'm gonna rotate it, double check. Everything's still in line. So that's good. Still got tension there. Okay, so now we got our camshafts installed, and go ahead and throw your camshaft tensioner back in there. And that should bring everything up tight, and then you can spin it around a few times. Just check the chain tension, make sure it's... All right, now we can install our cam cover. One thing you want to make sure of is it's got these little pieces in here that can fall out. They're wedged in there pretty good, but make sure they're on both. And those fit into these tracks here on both. There are these dowel pins, like right here, and there's one up here too, so just make sure they go into the dowel pins. You may have to put a little pressure down on these camshafts, get them to line up right. There we go. Okay, so for the bolts that hold them in, the only two different ones are these two aluminum ones, and they're actually longer. And they go where the two dowel pins were. So top right and bottom left is where they fit in. And then the rest go, obviously, in the remaining places. And these don't have much torque. The torque value on these is 89 inch-pounds. So only 7.4 foot-pounds of torque on these. So we'll go ahead and do that and then move on to the next step. Okay, and very last thing for the moment, make sure this rubber gasket goes above where the spark plug goes in. Next, spark plug. Go ahead and put that back down in there. If you're lucky enough to have a spark plug tool come with your bike, just use that. And we'll tighten it down to 15 foot-pounds. All right, once we get a thin even coat on all the way around it, just from here to here, we can go ahead and put on our cylinder cover. But before we do that, take this last opportunity to just check your alignments one more time to make absolutely sure you're at top dead center before we put the cover on. All right, so on the cover, this gasket actually will come out, which I think is a little bit easier to help with the install. So you just go ahead and set that in place. And press it down into place over here. We got your new liquid gasket. It'll seal down in there. And now you can just take the cover, stick it on, make sure it seats down on there. And now we can install our cover bolts. There's 3 of them. And these all torque to, these all torque to only 89 inch-pounds, so 7.4 foot-pounds, not too much. Again, just be sure not to over torque these.